The Democratic Alliance Policy Conference is underway, having already adopted several policies yesterday. The conference dealt with the values and principles of the party on the first day. These include its policy on economic justice, in which it rejected race as a way to categorize people. The conference also adopted the principle of separation of state and party separation of powers, federalism and constitutionalism, as well as the rule of law, among other policies. The virtual event, which concludes today, comes on the heels of long-standing member John Moody's resignation this week. Moody cited the dominance of white conservatives and the purging of black leaders. Newzroom Africa's senior reporter Ziyanda Ngcobo joins us to unpack what we can expect further. Ziyanda, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us on Weekend Dawn, Channel 405. In fact, it's always a pleasure chatting to you. Let's get serious though. What's taken place over the past 24 hours within the DA's policy conference, and what they're giving us or letting us know what has taken place, what do you think is going to be taking place today? And this issue of race, it seems as though it's the main talker, whether they want to admit it or not.
That's true, Jacob. And I mean, just starting off with the issue of the fact that the DA has not even opened up the conference to the media and the public is an indictment on the state of the party at this particular point in time. It's quite bizarre that this is an organization, a political party, in fact, that always says that it's preparing itself as it's a leader in waiting to take over from the ANC, and yet the public and the media are not being given an opportunity to scrutinize the kind of policies that are on offer. Another thing, Jacob, is that there is a sense from many of the black leaders within the party that this exercise of this policy conference is just a mere exercise of rubber stamping policies that have been crafted by Federal Chairperson Helen Zille and her ally in the policy unit, Gwen Ngwenya. And so the issue of race and the adoption of all the draft proposals, by the way, Jacob, there were 18 draft proposals and all of them were adopted by the conference, is also giving credence to this notion that, this was a rubber stamping exercise. But also, if you look at all the newspapers this morning, the City Press and Sunday Times in particular, you will see that this also issue of race, not just as a policy, in terms of policy direction, but just within the party amongst the black leaders, there has been an issue about a supposed purge within the DA. And this is something that John Moody actually mentioned this week when he was resigning after 22 years of being in the DA, saying that those who had been supporting Mmusi Maimane in the run-up to the general elections, where the DA, of course, lost some of their votes to the Freedom Front Plus, they're saying that those who supported Maimane and who supported the idea that race should also form part of the formulation of legislation are now being purged, and of course then setting up the mood ahead of the elective Congress at the end of October, where it will permanently become the leader of the Democratic Alliance.
So do you really think they are in a situation to purge, as they're saying in the Sunday newspapers, the black possible candidates who would be fighting for the leadership of the DA? And what does that say about the party for their image? I mean, from the average voter out there who may have voted for the DA, what does it say about the party's image?
Well, for all intents and purposes, if you look at, the nature of the charges that these leaders are facing and the fact that you can't run away from the fact that they're actually black leaders, barring Helen Zille, who's also going to be facing the commission for her tweets. We know that when Helen Zille goes and presents herself, it's almost a box-ticking exercise because nothing much gets done. It's Phumzile Van Dam, who's an MP. It's the likes of Zwagele Mncwango and KZN, who has been in support of Maimane, but also now is in support of Mbali Ntuli, who is currently John Steenhuisen's running mate. It's clear that the purge of leaders who are not seen to be within Helen's camp is well underway. And this is what John Moody actually mentioned when he left, to say as well that the DA, according to him, is not concerned with actually becoming a ruling party, but rather actually maintaining that 20% threshold, but serving, the narrow interests of white nationalists within the country. And so the issue of the DA losing ground during those national general elections to Freedom Front Plus is actually a preoccupation of the DA, rather than actually being a representative of the black majority of the country, just by virtue of looking at their stance on race when it comes to legislation. It's understood that these leaders who are now facing charges conveniently before the party is meant to go to an elective Congress, conveniently it's the people who've been in support of Mbali Ntuli taking over as leader of the party, is also an indication of the racial dynamics within the party, and also it tells you about how they plan to deal with redress. These are the leaders who've been speaking out about the fact that you can't speak about redress in South Africa and the historical injustices without including race. Now, the DA and its policy documents that they adopted yesterday say that while race is a social construct, they do acknowledge that racialism and racism have previously existed, but for a party, they adopt a policy of non-racial racism rather than multi-racialism.
Let's talk a little more about the 200 participants unanimously adopting this principle of separation of state and party, separation of powers, federalism and constitutionalism, and the rule of law. You think the DA is capable of actually following through with that?
Well, I think, that's one of, the easier proposals, because that was put forward, because those have always existed within the DA. I think one of the issues that was interesting that came out of the DA's Congress, which are quite contradictory to what is happening now, is what they speak about in terms of openness and transparency, that everyone has a right to feel free to speak out in the party. They should be open. Individuals are accepted. Now, this is contrary to what we've seen happen when leaders leave the DA, especially the black leaders who leave the DA, always speak about the fact that they haven't felt free enough within the party to speak about certain issues, in particular when it comes to topical issues such as race, which by implication affect, policies such as triple BEE, but also when it comes to land reform, education, which have been on the South African agenda for quite some time. And also another, policy that they adopted during that conference yesterday was on the issue of evidence-based decision making. Now, this is quite critical, because when Mmusi Maimane left, he was criticized for trying to make the DA ANC light, relying largely on rhetoric, and actually that the issues that he was putting on the table on behalf of the DA were actually not going to take the party anyway, and that's why you recall he fell on his sword. That's why when the party was moving to charge him, they charged him for actually not being able to bring policy clarity to the organization. And if you listen to the DA's policy unit head, Gwening Gwenya, she seems to, bring forward the argument that things such as race. She says race is not something that you can quantify. Therefore, race is just a proxy of a much larger issue of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And rather than looking at race, you should rather deal with the drivers of poverty, the drivers of inequality, and the drivers of unemployment. But what the DA will struggle with, and is still struggling with, is actually being able to continue with that trope while actually saying we are trying to address the injustices of the past. Because if you're not going to address the issue of race, then, Jacob, it's very difficult then to say you represent the black majority. And I think this is why the black leaders of the party have been fighting so hard internally to actually have this addressed.
Ziyanda, my final question in conclusion, very quickly, what do you think is going to come out of today's part of this policy conference, and do you think it will be positive?
Well, today the party is going to be discussing the economy, and this is a follow-up from what they were discussing yesterday. So essentially, the values and principles were discussed yesterday, and it was to set the organization up as a foundation to say, so we all agree that we want a social market economy, for an example, which is what the DA has adopted. We all accept the principle of openness, integrity, constitutionalism, a federal state, etc. So it's on that basis then that they are going to try and actually formulate economic policy, and especially since the country finds itself, even before COVID-19, found itself in a very dire economic position. But again, Jacob, it's going to be quite difficult for the party to do so without actually, without being able to avoid the issues such as race, non-racialism, how they'll grapple that. If you remember how much the DA, received so much backlash from the public when it came to their stance on triple BEE. It'll be interesting to see how these values and principles will guide them in the economic process. I don't think many people who are in the other camp, that are in Mbalentuli's camp, or those who are opposed to Helen Zilla's faction, are going to be satisfied with the results of this particular conference, given the fact that they already feel as though this is a rubber stamping exercise, in particular because from the floor during this conference. And so that also added and fueled this idea that this was merely just a box ticking exercise. So certainly we'll hear from the DA tomorrow after their conference. They're quite confident that they'll come out stronger than they were before. That's according to Dr. Ivan Meyer, who's the Federal Council chairperson. But of course, this is just a precursor, Jacob, to that elective Congress, which is taking place at the end of October. And given the fact that there are so many black leaders within the DA who are facing charges, which seems like a purge, it will be interesting to see how Mbalentuli's campaign does unfold going forward, and if she too will still remain within the party after this campaign trail.
Newzroom Africa's senior politics reporter, Ziyanda Ngcobo, thank you so much for your time. She was chatting to us about the latest regarding the DA policy conference and what we can expect as it wraps up on day 2.